Beach visitors thought he was just another retired lifeguard who enjoyed helping families stay safe in the water. But when danger came from the sea, they learned that some guardians never really stop guarding, and some waves carry more than just water. Welcome to True Human Tales. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden courage and maritime protection, tell me in the comments from which city in the world are you watching today. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These moments of quiet heroism deserve to be remembered. Sunset Beach stretched along California's central coast like a postcard from paradise, 2 miles of golden sand where families had been making memories for generations. The beach featured gentle waves perfect for children, and the kind of laid-back atmosphere that made visitors forget their worries. For the past 6 years, Captain Joe Sullivan had been the senior lifeguard at Sunset Beach, though everyone just called him Captain Joe. He was 68 years old, with weathered skin, silver hair usually hidden under a faded red lifeguard cap, and the patient demeanor that made nervous parents trust him completely. Joe's lifeguard tower sat at the center of the beach's main swimming area, positioned to provide optimal views of the surf zone. From his elevated perch, he could monitor up to 500 beachgoers on busy summer days, tracking everything from toddlers building sandcastles to teenagers testing their limits. The community adored Captain Joe. He knew every regular family by name, remembered which children were learning to swim, and always had Band-Aids and kind words for scraped knees. "Captain Joe," 8-year-old Marcus would call out every morning. "Are the waves good today?" "Perfect for young adventurers like you," Joe would reply. "But remember the rules. Stay between the flags." What the beach community didn't know was that Captain Joe Sullivan had spent 22 years with the United States Coast Guard, the last 8 as commander of an elite maritime security response team. He'd led boarding operations against drug smugglers, coordinated rescues in hurricane conditions, and conducted counter-terrorism missions in waters that appeared on no tourist maps. Joe had retired from the Coast Guard 6 years ago after an operation involving maritime traffickers that had cost him 2 team members. The guilt and trauma had driven him to seek peace by the same ocean that had defined his career, but this time protecting families instead of hunting criminals. Tuesday morning started like every Tuesday for the past 6 years. Joe arrived at Sunset Beach at 7 a.m. to perform his daily assessment. Ocean conditions, weather patterns, crowd predictions, habits from his Coast Guard days, where situational awareness meant the difference between success and failure. He climbed his lifeguard tower and began his equipment check. Rescue buoy, first aid supplies, emergency radio, binoculars. His movements were methodical, professional, though they appeared routine to observers. The first beachgoers arrived around 9 a.m., mostly retirees and parents with young children. Joe knew most of them by sight. The Chen family, whose daughter Sophie was learning to swim, the Rodriguez twins, who competed building sandcastles, Mrs. Patterson, who walked the beach every morning. "Good morning, Captain Joe," called out Jennifer Williams, setting up her family's umbrella. "How's the water today?" "Beautiful and calm, perfect for the little ones," Joe replied, watching her 6-year-old son Tommy already eyeing the waves. As more families arrived, Joe fell into his familiar rhythm. Visual sweeps every 30 seconds, radio check-ins every hour, gentle reminders about sunscreen and hydration. It was meditation in motion, a peaceful routine that had helped heal wounds most people couldn't see. Joe's background in maritime security had taught him to read ocean conditions and human behavior with equal skill. He could predict which teenagers would push boundaries, which children needed extra watching. But Sunset Beach was different from his old missions. Here, families came to find joy, not danger. At 2:47 p.m., Joe was applying sunscreen to a child's shoulders when he noticed movement on the horizon that didn't belong. 3 speedboats approaching from the northwest, moving in formation at high speed toward the beach. The boats were identical, unusual for pleasure craft. Their approach angle avoided marked boating channels. Most telling, they maintained tactical spacing that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Joe continued his lifeguard duties while monitoring the boats. 22 years of maritime training had developed his observation skills beyond normal capability. He could assess potential threats while appearing focused on beach safety. "Captain Joe, can I go out to the sandbar?" asked 12-year-old Emma Foster. "Let's wait a few minutes, sweetheart," Joe replied, his eyes tracking the approaching boats. "I want to make sure conditions are perfect." The speedboats were closer now, and Joe could see details that made his blood run cold. Too many passengers for pleasure craft, dark clothing despite the heat, equipment that looked tactical rather than recreational. Joe activated his emergency radio. "Beach Control, this is Tower 1. I need immediate response to Sunset Beach. 3 suspicious watercraft approaching with possible hostile intent." The dispatcher's voice crackled back. "Tower 1, can you confirm threat level?" Joe watched through his binoculars as the lead boat's passengers began revealing weapons. "Confirmed hostile. Armed subjects. Estimated 12 to 15 individuals. This is not a drill." The boats were 200 yards offshore now, close enough for Joe to see assault rifles and tactical gear. This wasn't random crime. This was an organized operation targeting a crowded public beach. Joe's transformation was immediate and complete. 22 years of Coast Guard training overrode 6 years of peaceful routine in a heartbeat. His breathing slowed, his vision sharpened, and his mind shifted into the tactical awareness state that had kept him alive in maritime operations from the Caribbean to the Persian Gulf. He keyed his radio again, this time using Coast Guard protocols. "Beach Control, this is Captain Joseph Sullivan, former USCG Maritime Security Response Team Commander. I have visual on armed waterborne threats preparing to assault a civilian beach. Recommend immediate evacuation and tactical response." The dispatcher paused. "Captain Sullivan, did you say former Coast Guard?" "Affirmative. MSRT team leader, 22 years active duty. I'm initiating emergency protocols." Joe began clearing the beach with calm efficiency that masked deadly purpose. His voice carried authority that made people respond immediately without panic. "Attention beach visitors," he announced through his megaphone. "We need everyone to move calmly toward the parking areas. This is a safety precaution, not an emergency. Please gather your belongings and walk, don't run, to your vehicles." Families began packing up, most assuming this was a routine safety measure, but Joe was watching the speedboats with tactical precision, counting weapons and assessing the threat level. The lead boat had changed course, heading directly for the main swimming area where 30 minutes ago, over 200 people had been enjoying the afternoon. Joe reached into his equipment locker for items he'd hoped never to need again: a tactical radio, emergency flares, and something else that made his hands steady with muscle memory: his retired service weapon, maintained and secured according to federal regulations for former military personnel. The speedboats reached the surf zone at 3:15 p.m., just as the last families were clearing the beach. Joe had managed to evacuate most civilians, but a few stragglers remained: an elderly couple walking slowly toward the parking lot, a teenager who'd been surfing and hadn't heard the evacuation order, and a family with a crying toddler who was moving too slowly. Joe watched through his binoculars as armed men began jumping from the boats into waist-deep water. 12 individuals total, all carrying assault weapons, moving with military precision toward shore. This wasn't a random attack. This was a coordinated assault on American soil. Joe's maritime training told him exactly what this was: a coastal infiltration operation, probably drug-related, using a public beach as cover for landing illegal cargo or personnel. But the timing was wrong. They'd chosen a crowded afternoon when any professional smuggler would have picked an isolated night landing. These weren't smugglers. These were terrorists. Joe activated his tactical radio and called in coordinates to Coast Guard Sector Los Angeles, using encryption codes he still remembered from his active duty days. "Sector LA, this is former MSRT Commander Sullivan. Hostile coastal assault in progress, Sunset Beach, coordinates 35.1428 north, 120.6596 west, 12 armed subjects, probable terrorist operation. Request immediate air and sea support." The response was immediate. "Commander Sullivan, this is Sector LA. Air support en route, ETA 8 minutes. Can you maintain overwatch?" Joe looked at the families still struggling to reach safety, then at the armed men now wading through the surf toward American families. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. "Negative, Sector. I'm going active." Joe moved down from his lifeguard tower with tactical precision that felt as natural as breathing. He'd studied Sunset Beach for 6 years, noting sight lines, cover positions, and tactical advantages with the automatic awareness of someone trained to assess combat environments. The beach offered limited cover, mostly rocks and the lifeguard station itself. But Joe had something more valuable than terrain advantage. He knew exactly how maritime assault teams operated because he'd led dozens of them. The terrorists had made several tactical errors. They'd landed during daylight with civilians present, limiting their movement options. They'd bunched up in the surf zone instead of spreading out for overwatch. Most critically, they'd assumed the beach was undefended. Joe positioned himself behind the rocks near the north end of the beach, where he had clear fields of fire and multiple escape routes. His service weapon felt familiar in his hands, muscle memory from thousands of hours of training and real-world operations. "Stop! Coast Guard!" Joe's command voice echoed across the beach with authority that came from 2 decades of maritime law enforcement. The terrorists spun toward his position, weapons raised, and Joe's training took over. His first shots were precise, controlled, designed to neutralize threats without endangering any remaining civilians. 2 attackers down immediately, the others seeking cover in the surf. The remaining terrorists returned fire, but they were fighting from an exposed position against someone who knew every inch of this terrain. Joe's response was surgical, the kind of precision shooting that had made him legendary among Coast Guard boarding teams. Coast Guard helicopters appeared on the horizon as Joe was securing the beach. The terrorists who hadn't been neutralized were attempting to retreat to their speedboats, but Joe's tactical positioning had cut off their escape routes. "Sunset Beach, this is Coast Guard Air Station Los Angeles," crackled through Joe's tactical radio. "We have visual on your position. Outstanding work, Commander." Joe coordinated with the air support using procedures from his active duty days. The remaining terrorists were apprehended without further casualties, their speedboats intercepted by Coast Guard cutters. Detective Maria Santos arrived with local police backup to find Joe calmly securing evidence and providing tactical briefings to Coast Guard investigators. She stared at the Lifeguard tower, then at the man who'd just prevented a terrorist attack. "Captain Sullivan, I need to understand what happened here. The Coast Guard is calling this a prevented mass casualty incident." Joe looked at the families now safely gathered in the parking lot, many recognizing their beloved Lifeguard despite the different context. "Maritime terrorists attempted a coastal assault. Standard interdiction protocols applied." "Standard for who? You're a lifeguard." Joe smiled for the first time since the boats had appeared. "I'm a Coast Guard officer, Detective. I just happen to watch over swimmers when I'm not stopping bad guys." The terrorist cell's identity sent shockwaves through federal law enforcement. They were part of an international network planning coordinated attacks on American coastal targets. Their intelligence had identified Sunset Beach as a soft target with minimal security. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh from the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force reviewed Joe's response with amazement. "Commander Sullivan, your engagement probably prevented hundreds of casualties. These subjects had enough ordnance to devastate this entire beach." Joe studied the evidence photos with analytical eyes. They made the mistake of thinking a public beach was undefended. Someone should have told them Coast Guard officers never really retire. "Why didn't you tell the community about your background? People would have felt safer knowing a former MSRT commander was watching their beach." Joe looked out toward Sunset Beach, where families were already returning to enjoy the afternoon surf. "Because I wanted them to trust their lifeguard, not fear their protector. Kids deserve to feel safe at the beach." The investigation revealed that the terrorist cell had specifically chosen Sunset Beach because their reconnaissance suggested it was typical with standard civilian security. They'd observed Joe for weeks, categorizing him as a non-threat. They had catastrophically miscalculated. The next morning, Joe returned to his lifeguard tower at 7 a.m. sharp, just like he had every morning for 6 years. The beach felt different now. News crews lingered at the edges, federal agents conducted interviews, and parents looked at their longtime lifeguard with new understanding. But when the first families arrived, children still ran toward Joe's tower with the same excitement. "Captain Joe," 8-year-old Marcus called out, clutching his boogie board. "Are the waves good today?" Joe knelt down to the boy's level, his voice carrying the same gentle authority. "Perfect for young adventurers like you, Marcus, and you know what? They always will be." Marcus's father approached hesitantly. Captain Sullivan, we saw the news. We had no idea you were what you used to do. Joe stood up, adjusting his lifeguard cap. I'm still the same person, sir. I'm here to make sure kids like Marcus can enjoy the ocean safely. As the morning progressed, more parents approached Joe with gratitude and questions. The story had spread through the community. Their beloved lifeguard was a decorated military hero who'd spent 2 decades protecting America's coastlines. But Joe noticed something important. The children still saw him exactly the same way. To them, he wasn't a former MSRT commander or a terrorism prevention hero. He was just Captain Joe, the nice man who watched over them while they played in the waves. That's exactly how he wanted it. Captain Joe Sullivan continued serving as Sunset Beach's senior lifeguard for 3 more years before retiring completely at age 71. The lifeguard tower where he'd served was renamed Sullivan Station in his honor, though Joe had insisted they keep it simple. He never spoke publicly about his Coast Guard career or the events of that Tuesday afternoon. When reporters asked, he'd simply say that he was a lifeguard who'd done his job. But the beach community knew better. They understood that Captain Joe was the kind of person who would always stand between them and danger, whether it came from riptides or something much worse. Sometimes heroes don't retire from service, they just find new ways to protect the people they care about. Sometimes the most dangerous person on the beach is the elderly lifeguard with the patient smile and the red cap, carrying skills and courage that most people can't imagine. Joe Sullivan had tried to leave his warrior days behind, but when terrorists threatened the families he'd grown to love like grandchildren, he remembered that some things are worth fighting for. A beach full of laughter. The right of children to play safely in the waves. The promise that good people will always stand between evil and those who cannot protect themselves. That's the most important protection of all. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone like Captain Joe? Someone who seemed like just a friendly community member until the moment they revealed the depths of their training and dedication? Someone whose quiet presence made you feel safer without knowing why? Tell me in the comments where are you watching from today and share their story with us. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us make sure they are. We publish human stories that matter every single week. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story. And remember, sometimes the person watching over you at the beach is exactly who you need when danger comes from the sea.